our first speaker today will be Kévin John. He is Assistant Professor in Epidemiology at Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers in Paris. He works on infectious disease epidemiology and modelling to understand the biological, behavioural and social determinants of infectious disease transmission, as well as to prevent and control infectious diseases. Some diseases he has worked on include HIV, yellow fever and hepatitis C. He's also been involved in projects relating to climate justice, citizen science, and encouraging social and environmental responsibility of the academic sector.
Thank you very much, Katie, for the nice introduction. So let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, very good. Thank you very much. So just to clarify, I will speak today as an academic, as Katie nicely presented, but also as the board member of an NGO, a French NGO called Sciences Citoyennes, which works in the interface between science, society, and democracy. And also I have a small conflict of interest today because I am also the PhD supervisor of Pearl, one of the co-founders of the seminar. So, I will speak about the environmental responsibility in the academic sector, especially why we have, to my sense, specific duties and responsibility within the academic sectors. So I'm pretty sure that I don't have to convince you about the importance of acting now regarding global changes, climate change, but I think always nice to share the way we try to present it, to present this emergency outside. So to me, one of the most striking figure to present this, to advocate for this urgent need of action is from the 2018 report of the IPCC on climate change and the so-called 1.5 degree reports. So here you can see on that figure that you may know that from the Paris agreements, the states have accepted the target of to reach net zero emissions of greenhouse gas emissions by roughly around the middle of the 21st century. And here in the left of the panel, you can see two different targets. The one is reaching net zero CO2 emission in 2040, and the second presents just a small delay in reaching this net zero, which is reaching net zero in 2055. But actually, you know that CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere, and that taking too much time to fulfill this objective will translate into an added concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is the difference here in the panel in right. So if you reach net zero in 2040, you reach that level of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And if you delay this objective, you reach that level in gray. And this small difference is actually the difference between 1.5 degree of climate warming and 2 degrees of climate warming. And the difference between these both scenarios are actually huge. One of the most important, most striking difference is that, as you may know, every degrees of climate warming brings us closer to climate tipping points. You may know this tipping point that are points that are actually difficult to predict, but we think that if we reach these points, we can enter a new regimen of climate because of non-linearity systems, and that will put us in a situation that we can't really foresee, but which will be very difficult, that will basically change the climate regimen. So the most known of these tipping point, climate tipping point are, for example, the melting of the permafrost, or the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, the Arctic sea ice, and also the massive fires in the Amazon rainforest. And so once again, each degrees in climate change bring us closer to this tipping point, and honestly, you don't want to reach this tipping point. This is why Valérie Masson-Delmotte, which was the lead author of the IPCC report 2018, has this quote saying, "Every half degree counts, every year counts, every choice counts." So this is kind of the introduction why we should act, and why we should act now and not delaying this action. This is true for climate warming, but this is also true for biodiversity loss and overall, like all these global changes that we are facing for the moment, and that are relevant when we are interested in planetarials. So now, why is the academic sector specifically challenged for in facing this need for action? There's urgency of actions. First, the academic sectors is specifically challenged because the academic sectors is one of the source of numerous warnings. You may have heard of the warnings to humanity and the second warnings to humanity. There are texts that have been signed by tens of thousands of scientists urging societies and politics to take actions to tackle climate change. This has been there has been many replication of these calls that were even more and more serious and dramatic. And more recently in France, we have been this call from southern scientists calling like to the rebellion, basically saying that previous calls have not been heard, so we need to have one step further, to go one step further and join civil disobedience movements, such as, for example, Extinction Rebellion, you may have heard, because like, previous calls have not been heard, and we need to take action now, and we need to do all what we can to have this climate crisis faced by politics and societies. So this is one of the reasons why environmental responsibility is something specific for the academic sector. The other is that as scientists, we are well trained to critically assess the urgency of the situation. So we have access to the literature, we understand the methods that brings us the evidence about climate change, about biodiversity loss, and we are also trained to assess the different levels of actions, the different transitions we could trigger, we could implement. So this is to me why, as scientists, we have this kind of specific environmental responsibility. But for all warnings to be considered, and this is also linked to the question of responsibility, we need to be exemplary. If we are the community, the scientific community, and the professional sector rising alerts, then we must ourselves take these alerts seriously, and this puts us in a situation where we have to be exemplary. This has been, for example, underlined recently with, this is just an example, but an example of a climate scientist conference, scientific conference that emitted tons and tons of CO2. And this has been highly criticized, saying that how can the warmings be credible, be listened by the public, if also scientists burn more fuels, emit more CO2 than every other citizens? How can we be listened to in that situation? And that's why we have this kind of duty of exemplarism. So today I will briefly talk about this responsibility in academics. And to that, I will discuss about the direct and the indirect impact of the academic sector. So as direct impact, academics, as all professional activities, carry an environmental footprint. You can think about greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, waste, and this is something we should face, we should tackle. But we, as academics, we also have an indirect impact, because as academics, we have two main activities, which are teaching and doing research, and both activities aim at shaping tomorrow's world. And so in that sense, we also need to consider this indirect impact or action as scientists, as academics may have on the world, on tomorrow's world. And this is the point I will strike, that I will raise, that all these questions need individual but also institutional involvement. So some points about the direct environmental impact of research activities. So as I mentioned, in our daily occupational activity as academics, we have some impact, we have a footprint, and this footprint depends on the professional practices that also depend on the academic field. You can have field missions that needs you to go to the field, collect data. You can use more or less material depending on the academic field you're in. You can use more or less intensive computational machines demands depending on your, once again, on your academic field. But what is interesting at the moment is that several carbon impact assessments have now been made available at various levels. at the level of individual labs, academies, and in different academic fields. So I refer here to different studies for, once again, different groups, labs, or teams in different scopes, like, for example, digital sciences, atmospheric sciences, oceanography, or at the scale of a university. And once these guys did these carbon footprint assessments and shared the results, we can see that some pattern emerge, so clear pattern emerge clearly, despite the diversity of practices and academic fields. And here are the most striking shared results of these different carbon footprint assessments within the academic sector. First, in average, in these assessments, we can see that academics level of emission of greenhouse gas emission represents once to twice the level of an average European Union citizens. And this is just for their occupational level of emissions. So this doesn't account for the level of emission these academics may have in their private life. When we consider only professional activities, an average academic do emit once to twice the level of European Union citizens. So we emit more than any other citizen in Europe and in the globe. Second lesson is that the greenhouse gas emissions are really unequally distributed, and typically you have 10% of the staff that is often responsible of 50% of more of the global level of emissions. And guess what? These are not the junior scientists, but these are the senior scientists, more like the head of departments that concentrates these high level of emissions. And third lesson, which is very important to me, is that air travel always represents the most important source of greenhouse gas emission, between roughly 50% and 90%, and this is depending on the field, the academic field you're working in. For example, this 55% is from the lab of oceanography that I mentioned. We do have, they guys do have a lot of field mission with boats in the oceans, but still air travel represents the most important source of greenhouse gas emissions. And for other people working with computational material, here air travel represents roughly 90% of greenhouse gas emissions. So now that you have these results, I want you to think quickly about the frequent environmental policies you can see, we can witness in academics. I guess that you've always seen encouragement to waste your, to sort your waste, to turn lights off, or to print less. This is useful and this is a good first step, but my question is, are we really reaching the target here? The point that I want to see is that we need here evidence-based environmental policies to really reach the targets we want, to really decrease our footprint. If we are serious in reducing our footprint, then the conclusion is that let's fly less. So some air travels are useful for research and highly substitutable, like field missions, but others are very less useful or necessary, it says, like conferences and international meetings, for example. But why I mentioned that in the beginning, why here the institutional context matters is because actually academic rules do encourage this international mobility. We are, as scientists, who track records, we are evaluated on their track records, and they integrate scientific presentations in scientific conferences, presence in international consortium meetings. So the question is, how you can imagine to change quickly the practices, whole practices, if we stay embedded in a system that rewards high emission behaviors instead of discouraging it. And this is why we can consider that individual involvement is crucial, but we need also supportive institutional environments that are based on, like, here again, evidence. Hopefully there are some institutions that pave the way for this kind of environmental policy. Some example here in the UK and in Switzerland. And here are some of these principles that are really like just scientific thinking, evidence-based thinking. First is, do monitor your emissions, your footprint, to identify where you can reduce the most. Then take public engagement of reduction of these footprints. You can use approaches such as avoid and mitigate, for example, considering alternatives such as web conferences. And I must say here that the COVID-19 crisis has done much more than every advocacy we did before for web conferences. People were very skeptical about web conferences, but we had the proof of concept that it works, and it works pretty well during the COVID-19 crisis. And then you can also, as an institution, encourage, stimulate, or reward good behaviors, for example, including carbon sobriety criteria in the evaluation of scientists, teams, research projects. So once again, these are the institutional changes we want to see, and we will need to encourage our institution to adopt them. This is one of the conclusions. I will come back to that. In terms of responsibility in academia, as I mentioned, we have two main activities: teaching and researching. So as for teaching, well, this is the basic. The environmental crisis will impact every sector you can imagine. There is no single sector or academic field that won't be impacted by global changes. So the conclusion is that it should be taught, like the stakes of global changes must be taught in all academic programs. So if you are involved in teaching in any way, and you have this freedom of adapting your message, do integrate there's climate change, there's environmental teaching, share resources with others, and include that within your teaching. So we have another question to raise here about research. So I talked about the indirect impact of research, and here we must think also the objects of research, and ask ourselves whether the research we are conducting is really leading the world in a direction we want, that is desirable for a planet that can keep life in it, and human life and human society as best. And this is a very touchy topic, because here we are discussing the object of research of your colleagues or researchers, and this is really touchy, but I think this is a reflection we must have collectively into the academic sector. Scientists don't really like that others judge their research topics and assess the way they are conducting research, that they discuss their object topic. But we have examples to say that scientists are actually not so good at imagining the possible uses and misuses of their research. And here I won't enter into the detail, but I joined two references, example of human genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, that we'll talk about that later today. So I'm really curious to hear about that. So my point here is, like, we need to promote the debate about extended stakes of our own research objects in all different dimensions: ethical, environmental, economical, and social dimensions. So how do we do now to promote this environmental responsibility in academia? So as I told you, we do have a crucial role in including and promoting environmental responsibility in our own practice as academics. This is the duty of exemplarism I commented earlier. And also because if we manage to have coordinated action in our own professional sectors, then it could start a ripple effect into other professional sectors and convince others, basically. So I hope that I convinced you that we need responsible individuals, but we also require responsible institutions, and we need to discuss, to federate, to spread, to share, to push our own institutions to adopt their environmental responsibility that we think is really necessary. So this is my point. Here in the French context, we have this kind of groups that are emerging in the recent years. I gave you some links, and these are academics from very various sectors that are joining together to try to think about how we can address this environmental responsibility in research, and you have other links here. It was a bit longer, sorry about that. If you have any questions, any further discussion, you have my contact, and I include you some links and references. So, yeah, I think I've been a bit too long, but sorry about that. Thanks very much.